Hey, what's going on? Welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about Dying Light 2's brand new update, patch 1.79, also known as version 1.24.2. Now, if you've been keeping up with this game, you know that Techland has been steadily pushing out updates, hotfixes, and quality of life improvements for a while. But this one is actually pretty interesting because it addresses some things players have been asking for in the background for quite some time. So let's just hang out and talk through all of it, and I'll give you my thoughts as we go along. Almost like we're just sitting around having a chat about the game instead of me rattling off a list. First off, the biggest change in this update is the new auto backup system for saves. Now, for anybody who's ever played an open world game with tons of hours sunk into it, you already know how nerve-wracking it can be when your save file gets corrupted or something weird happens and suddenly all that progress is at risk. Dying Light 2, being this huge, branching open-world survival RPG with choices that actually matter, puts even more pressure on your save files. People have been reporting for months that sometimes their data gets messed up or they lose progress because of bugs or crashes. And while Techland has patched and addressed many of those cases, this is their first real step at putting a safeguard in place. What this auto backup system does is essentially keep multiple save states of your game so that if something goes wrong, you're not completely stuck. Imagine grinding out gear, finishing missions, or making those big story decisions, and then your game crashes. Normally, if you're unlucky, you'd be forced to start all over from your last checkpoint. But with this system, the game has your back by storing backups that you can roll back to if something gets corrupted. It's peace of mind for long-term players, and honestly, I think it's one of those things that should have been in the game since launch, but hey, better late than never. The second thing that stood out to me is small but very noticeable. They added a skip button for the intro text. Now, if you've been booting up Dying Light 2 regularly, you know that before you can even get into the menu, there's always that chunk of text you've had to sit through. And yeah, the first time you see it, you might read it, maybe the second time too, but after dozens of launches, it just becomes noise that you want to get past as quickly as possible. It's the kind of small annoyance that builds up over time. With this update, Techland finally said, all right, let's give players a way to skip it. And I'm not going to lie, it feels like a relief to have that little bit of control. Sometimes it's the smallest quality of life improvements that make the overall experience smoother, and this is definitely one of those. Speaking of quality of life improvements, Techland mentioned that they've bundled in several under-the-hood adjustments in this patch. Now, they weren't very specific about what exactly those changes were, but usually when they phrase it that way, it's things like tweaks to the interface, small fixes to menus, maybe streamlining certain interactions, and possibly just cleaning up lingering bugs. And while it can be frustrating to not have every little detail spelled out in patch notes, the reality is you usually notice these improvements the more time you spend playing after the update. For example, a button press that used to feel slightly delayed might suddenly feel more responsive, or something in the inventory might load quicker, or maybe your HUD displays info in a way that feels more polished. These things don't always sound like game changers on paper, but when you spend hours with the game, they add up. Now let's talk about stability and bug fixes, because this is another big reason people stick around for updates. Techland said they addressed multiple bugs and stability issues with this patch. Again, they weren't super transparent with every single fix, but given how huge this game is, bugs are always going to creep in. Some players were still reporting minor crashes, quest triggers not working properly, and odd glitches with the environment. I can say from personal experience that while Dying Light 2 has come a long way since its launch, it still has those moments where something feels off, like enemies not reacting properly or an NPC just freezing mid-animation. So every little fix in this area is welcome, because the smoother the game runs, the more immersive the experience feels. And honestly, what I think is interesting is how Techland is pacing these updates. They're not just dropping massive expansions back to back. Instead, they're slowly polishing up the core systems, while occasionally giving us events and special content to keep the world feeling alive. For example, just a while ago, we had the Winter Tales event with those gifts from above in Villador, and that kept players busy with unique rewards and limited time fun. Updates like 1.79 might not look flashy compared to a big event, but they're laying the foundation to make sure that when the next big content update drops, everything is stable and ready. So if you're someone who maybe hasn't touched the game in a while, and you're wondering, is now a good time to come back? I'd honestly say, yeah, especially if stability was something holding you back. With the auto backup system now in place, you don't have to stress as much about your save files, and the general improvements are only going to make your sessions smoother. And let's not forget, Techland has been committed to long-term support for this game. They already promised years of updates and new content, so every patch like this is another sign they're still on track to make Dying Light 2 a long-lasting experience. What I also appreciate is how the team is listening to player feedback. The skip intro option might sound small, but think about it. People have been asking for that for ages, and Techland delivered. The save backup system is another example of them paying attention to frustrations that the community has been vocal about. It's easy for devs to only focus on flashy new DLCs or paid content, but when they take time to improve the actual quality of playing day to day, it shows they care about keeping players engaged in the long run. Let's talk a little about how these kinds of updates impact different types of players. For casual players, the auto backup system might not sound like a huge deal, because they might not even run into save corruption issues. But for hardcore players, the ones who play on harder difficulties, who experiment with different choices, or who put in hundreds of hours grinding, this update is almost like insurance. It protects their time investment. For speedrunners or challenge runners, it also means fewer worries about losing everything to some freak accident. And then for people who just pop in every few weeks, the skip button alone makes starting the game less of a chore, which might encourage them to play more often. I also want to point out that Techland's approach here is about building trust. When a studio consistently fixes issues, listens to players, and makes improvements, even if they're small, it creates this sense of reliability. People start to feel confident that the game is in good hands, and that makes them more likely to stick around or come back later. Compare that to games where the devs drop updates but don't really address core complaints, and you can see why Dying Light 2 is still very much alive years after launch. Now, you might be wondering if this patch added any hidden extras or surprises, like maybe a new weapon blueprint, some tweaks to combat, or changes to nighttime encounters. From what I can tell, there weren't any secret additions this time around. It really was focused on stability and those specific improvements. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes you don't need a giant chunk of new content. Sometimes it's just about making sure the game feels smoother, more reliable, and more player-friendly. Another thing worth mentioning is that Dying Light 2 is still a massive game with branching choices, so updates like these indirectly improve replayability. If you've ever hesitated to start a new run because you were worried about bugs messing with your save, that's less of a problem now. And if you're someone who likes trying out different story paths, you can jump in with more confidence. And you know what's funny? Every time Techland drops one of these updates, it reminds me just how different this game feels compared to when it first launched. Back at release, the game was rough around the edges. There were tons of bugs, some pretty frustrating technical issues, and features that felt half-baked. Over time, though, the updates have shaped it into something far more polished. And this 1.79 patch continues that trend. It's not flashy, it's not headline-grabbing, but it's one more brick in the foundation of what Dying Light 2 is becoming. So let's imagine you're someone who's been away from the game for 6 months. You come back now, and you've got a smoother save system, less hassle when booting the game, better stability overall, and maybe even some small quality-of-life touches that weren't spelled out, but you'll notice once you play. Suddenly, the game feels more welcoming, less frustrating, and more rewarding to spend time in. That's the kind of incremental improvement that makes players stick around for years. I think what I'm most curious about is what Techland has planned next, because usually when they roll out stability updates like this, it means they're preparing the ground for something bigger.